Howdy. Thank you all for coming to my talk today. I'm going to be talking about bottom water temperature change in the Gulf of Mexico, especially with respect to fish and fisheries. So to jump on in, the Gulf of Mexico is a semi-enclosed sea, which presents really unique challenges to fish because there's a nonlinear coastline that restricts poleward movements that we would otherwise expect in other seas that have a linear coastline like the Atlantic. So in that situation, you have a linear gradient, a temperature gradient, in which fish follow north to maintain their optimal temperature. But here we have to ask, how has climate change impacted fisheries in the Gulf when they have this unique challenge? So the first step to go about doing this is to ask, how have climate proxies like bottom temperature changed in the Gulf of Mexico? In our study, we really are interested in reef fish. So we're going to answer these questions. The problem with answering these questions is that we have very limited and inconsistent data collection here. Just to set the scene, this is all the CTD casts that have been collected in the World Ocean Database 2018 that include salinity and temperature and that were done along the Gulf of Mexico continental shelf. So you can clearly see in this LATEX or Louisiana-Texas region, there's the most sampling effort. And then in the West Florida Shelf, there's much less sampling effort. In the Mexican shelves and the Cuban shelves, almost non-existent in this World Ocean Database. So we have to overcome these problems, and the way that we go about it when we want to understand how fish and reef fish are impacted by climate change, we do have to rely on models. Previous studies that have attempted to answer these questions as well have used sea surface temperature. But again, like I said, we're interested in reef fish because these are highly commercially important and recreationally important. The studies that have used sea surface temperature have done it primarily because sea surface temperature is available. You can use satellite altimetry, you can pull that information, that's pretty easy. Unfortunately, we care about reef fish, they don't live at the surface, so we need bottom water temperature. And again, this is why we have to rely on models. So our questions that we're going to go over today are, one, are bottom water temperatures changing over time? And if they are, what are the rates of change? And are these changes homogeneous or are they discrete in space? Because right now, the current narrative is that the Gulf of Mexico is warming based on the sea surface temperature analyses that have been done. And it's said, you know, across the Gulf, we see homogeneous warming. And so if we find that they're discrete, we want to know, what is the spatial patterning of bottom temperature trends? Is it random or is it meaningful organized regions that could be really useful for resource managers? So we go about doing this using the hybrid coordinate ocean model, which is an ocean model that provides data for salinity, temperature, and velocity. And we use experiment 50.1, which is a reanalysis model of just the Gulf of Mexico. To give you an idea of how HICOM works, HICOM grids the Gulf of Mexico into 1/25th degree grid cells. Here, this is about a 1 degree, just for your visualization. Our grids are actually much, much smaller. And then we're only concerned about the continental shelf, because this is where most of our reef fishes occur. So when we're going through this extraction process, we mask the rest of the Gulf of Mexico, just extract what's on the continental shelf. And then, like I said, we're concerned about max depth. And the way HICOM provides data is in a gridded depth measurement as well, where you have shallower depths have shallower standardized depth bins and deeper depths have much larger depth bins. And what we wanted, again, is maximum depth, which we extracted here. These are the yellow bins, or the maximum depth bins within a grid cell. And this produced about over 33,000 grid cells along that continental shelf for over 6,000 days. And this is between 1996 and 2012. So once we had our data, we went through a model validation process that unfortunately I don't have the time to talk about in depth, but our big takeaways are that we used data from 1996 to 2012 because we found a large model state change in salinity and temperature prior to 1996. And even though that we've reduced our time series, we now feel more confident that it actually is representative of the conditions of the Gulf. Additionally, we compared our HICOM estimates of the deepest depth bin to CTD casts that we talked about earlier from the World Ocean Database. And what we found was that there was an offset where HICOM was on average about 0.38 degrees warmer plus or minus 0.03. Note that all of our error presented here is at 95% confidence. And this offset was stationary over time. So it wasn't changing over time, was not significantly drifting, so we could correct for the offset and move forward. So back to our big question at hand, now that we feel confident about what our data is telling us. Are bottom water temperatures changing over time? We did this using a linear regression for ordinary least squares regression framework, including sinusoids to account for seasonal signals, because we weren't interested in those seasonal signals. We were interested in the underlying interannual variation. And we're testing the null hypothesis. There's no change in bottom temperature over time, right? Again, we use a 0.05 confidence interval, and we assessed our error using autoregressive models. And then for our spatial purposes, if a trend was found to be insignificant, based on our null hypothesis, we corrected the slope to 0, because that means that in that grid cell, there was no change in bottom temperature over time. So here's the cool thing. We did find that there are significant bottom temperature changes over time in the Gulf of Mexico continental shelf. And globally, Gulf of Mexico wide, we found net cooling of about negative 0.005. That's like near 0, right? So it's still significant, but it's saying like there's near 0 change. But when you look at it regionally by each grid cell, I'm going to give you a second to take this in, because this is the meat of our study. Whites are representing there's no change in bottom temperature between 1996 and 2012. Reds represent warming, and blues represent cooling. So there's a lot of interesting things that are going on here, but one that I'm going to point out today is this cooling in the West Florida shelf. Pretty counterintuitive. So what we found and what we hypothesized is that this cooling has something to do with this pressure point. And the pressure point is a term coined by Yang Gang that when the loop current is in contact here, it allows shelf-wide upwelling, because cooler water that is upwelled follows these shallow water isobaths all the way up the continental shelf, right? So what we found, or what previous studies have found, is that between the 1993 and 2015, the extent of our study, there has been an increased day in the loop current in this contact position with the pressure point. So basically, this is a mechanism for why we're seeing cooling on this West Florida shelf. So your big takeaways from this plot are, one, there are sub-regional circulation features at play, right? You see that we have an upwelling system right here. We have a potential upwelling system here. And then because of our pressure point connection, we have a potential change in our circulation in this LATEX or Louisiana-Texas region. These are pretty cool takeaways because they're counterintuitive to the previous narrative on temperature change and climate change in the Gulf of Mexico. So now that we found that our bottom temperature changes are discrete, we wanted to know what type of spatial patterning. And we wanted to have a statistically meaningful way to identify that for resource managers. And I used Global Moran's I, which is a statistics test that basically pulls out and says, yes, you do have spatial autocorrelation between your points. Because of the way that HICOM is modeled and interpolated, we increased our confidence interval to 0.01 because we knew that there's a higher chance of a type 1 error. And this Global Moran's I index indicates that the spatial patterning is statistically organized and there is spatial clustering in the data. So what we can do is now pull out statistically meaningful regions of high and low. So what you're looking at is an optimal hotspot analysis where blues represent cold spots and reds represent hot spots. So these are regions of high climate vulnerability. So our take-home messages today are, one, the semi-enclosed seas have unique geomorphology that impose regional circulation trends that cause variation in bottom temperature. Next, basin-wide evaluations in semi-enclosed seas are very important because we can't assume the same conditions are occurring across the basin. And these methods can be applied to other semi-enclosed seas like the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and the Persian Gulf. Additionally, we encourage resource managers to consider these methods and allocate resources to the identified hot and cold spots because this is a statistically meaningful way of identifying climate vulnerable regions. And lastly, the Gulf of Mexico has lots of commercially and recreationally managed fish, and these fish have been responding to climate change in what other studies have reported as an ambiguous and nuanced way. But what we suggest is that from our results, there might not be a single climate gradient that fish are following. They might be following multiple climate gradients that look ambiguous, but they could be meaningful. So the follow-up study to this, chapter 2, is going to be, do these species track climate velocities? Because this will be huge and meaningful to understanding climate change. And lastly, we want to say, yes, this is a short timeline, 1996 to 2012, but it was the data available. And as of 3 weeks ago, a new HICOM reanalysis was released. And we encourage future studies to look at extending our time series to include this new HICOM model, which runs from 2001 to 2023. So with that, I would like to thank everyone, including my co-authors, as well as Dr. Yang Liu and Dr. Manny Karnauskas, as well as my funding, the Knight Fellowship, and several of my scholarship donors. Any questions?